in Afghanistan. You have some experience in Afghanistan. So let's start with U.S. troops withdrawal from Afghanistan. How do you see it impact the situation in Afghanistan?
This is a tough topic to talk about even a year in. I think at this point, everybody collectively, it doesn't matter political party, military, intelligence, everybody's publicly come out and said the withdrawal did not really go according to plan, or that perhaps there was things that we could have done better. But look, the reality is we can't go back in time. We need to take a honest, accountable assessment of the current operating environment, which is that the Taliban has basically taken control of the entire country. Afghanistan has become the global epicenter of terror. It's become the global epicenter of narcotics, heroin-based narcotics, so like opium, morphine, heroin, but also methamphetamine. The Taliban have got into the crystal meth business, and in a big, big way. We also see Afghanistan emerging as a new proxy state for the great power competition. We see interest with China and Pakistan in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is rich with resources, over $1 trillion of rare earth minerals that are a huge and pivotal point of contention and competition between near-peer state adversaries. So there's an interest in China, Russia, the United States. I think the current state of affairs in Afghanistan is worse than at any point in time that I've ever seen, including prior to the war. So my one-year assessment, my long way of coming back around here, my one-year assessment is that things are really, really bad. I believe that the country will be used as the primary source country for external operations attacks against the West, whether it's Al-Qaeda or another organization. I believe that this is going to be their primary safe haven. And I think that we have a challenging environment ahead of us, particularly if we're not going to be utilizing kinetic military capabilities and we're going to have to use soft power options. But I do think that there are options.
Has some interest inside Afghanistan. At the same time, you see China also dealing with Taiwan. So how do you see overall China interest in Afghanistan? Are they really friends with the Taliban? What they're trying to take out of Afghanistan?
No. So the key point here, and I think a lot of people, even in international affairs, don't really understand this key point, is that Afghanistan and Taiwan are connected. There's about $1 trillion in rare earth elements or rare earth minerals, such as neodymium, dysprosium, cobalt, lithium in Afghanistan that China has an incredible interest in. And conversely, there's a semiconductor industry that's very successful and influential in Taiwan. And that industry is composed of a lot of micro components with really advanced intellectual property for these various micro components that goes into these small chips. And the materials are sourced from those rare minerals. So China's play to basically take over the world is twofold. They want to control the technology landscape and they want to control information. And Afghanistan and Taiwan are critical for their capability to do that. China is using its Belt and Road Initiative to lay the infrastructure for a telecommunications environment in emerging countries all over the world. So basically they're laying phone towers, for example. They're also selling Huawei and ZTE hardware, and they're trying to make it so that Chinese hardware is compatible with Chinese towers and telecommunications infrastructure, so that American phones, American computers won't be compatible with some of these networks. So this is part of the Chinese 5G Internet of Things, where they want that interoperability of systems on Chinese infrastructure. So once they can control that baseline infrastructure, then they want to have Chinese hardware. So think about their phones, Huawei, ZTE, these telecommunications companies. They want to lay the infrastructure of their hardware. And then they can control the software on that hardware. From there, they can suppress the information that they don't like that's not supportive of China, and they can propagate or push out whatever information they do like.
یک موضوع چند زاویه ویژه برنامه جدید صدای امریکا، بررسی و تحلیل موضوع داغ هفته از زاویه‌های مختلف. تماشای این برنامه را هر شنبه شب از ساعت 6 تا 6:30 دقیقه از چینل 469 شبکه ماهواره‌ای یاست و صفحات اجتماعی صدای امریکا فراموش نکنید.
So Taliban claim that the U.S. has violated the rights of of Afghanistan territorial rights, at the same time Doha Agreement, and they cannot do such an attack in Afghanistan. Do you think U.S. has a right to attack any kind of terrorist cell or targets inside Afghanistan?
Obviously, the Taliban have not met the prescribed talking points or agreements or what have you related to the Doha agreements. They have not lived up to it. Look at how they're treating women. Look at how many people they've killed, tortured, everything. They're not living up to their bargain in the first place. They're also not supposed to allow al-Qaeda to have safe haven in Afghanistan in the first place. My argument would be we don't even recognize the legitimacy of the Taliban regime. Obviously, when we withdrew, they took over very, very quickly. We don't recognize their legitimacy. Our international partners don't recognize their legitimacy. They're sanctioned and they're closed off from the world. So I would argue that they have no standing in any international collective to make the claim that we're violating their sovereignty.
So Taliban also accuses Pakistan for use of its airspace by U.S. drones and having such attacks on Afghanistan soil. Pakistan denied that, and you can tell us about Pakistan's role, how it is dealing with the Taliban when it comes to terrorist activities inside Afghanistan.
What countries may or may not be allowing the United States to utilize their airspace for whatever, that's outside the scope of what I can speak about. What I will say is any presumption by either the Pakistanis or the Taliban that suggests that they don't have a good working relationship right now is utterly absurd. We know that the Haqqani network acts as a proxy of the Pakistani intelligence service ISI. We know that they both have a relationship with the Taliban leadership, and we know that their leadership, their infrastructure has been placed into Taliban leadership. We know that there's a Haqqani in the upper echelon of Taliban leadership. So it's absurd to think that there's not interconnective tissue between the Pakistanis and the Taliban. Furthermore, I would argue that the Taliban regime, their Islamic emirate, is under such dire economic pressure that they need Pakistan and they need China. Now, China has employed Pakistan to assist with the security environment in Afghanistan because China wants to come into Afghanistan and extract all the rare minerals. Remember, we have that China-Pakistan economic corridor. We have that Belt and Road Initiative. Pakistan is heavily reliant on China. And they really need to make a sound security environment for China. They really need to smooth a lot of things out going on in Afghanistan. Keep in mind, when we talk about the Northern Resistance Front, okay, when we talk about the NRF, we talk about the Panjshir Valley, keep in mind that it was Pakistani aircraft that bombed our friends, our special operations allies in the Panjshir, presumably using smart missiles or laser-guided munitions provided by the United States to Pakistan for the express purpose of killing al-Qaeda or ISIS targets.
خوانندگان گرامی صدای امریکا، انتظار به پایان رسید. اکنون با دانلود کردن اپلیکیشن های NTH Link و سایفن شما به گونه مسئول با حفظ محرمیت به اینترنت بدون سانسور در هر جا دسترسی خواهید داشت. برای نصب کردن اپلیکیشن NTH Link اگر تلفن اندروید دارید به گوگل پلی و اگر آیفون دارید به اپل استور رفته و NTH Link را جستجو و دانلود کنید یا اپلیکیشن را مستقیما از این لینک دانلود کنید یا هم لینک دانلود مستقیم آن را برای تلفن اندروید با ارسال ایمیل به این آدرس دریافت کنید. برای نصب کردن اپلیکیشن سایفن اگر تلفنتان اندروید است به گوگل پلی و اگر آیفون است به اپل استور رفته و سایفن را جستجو و دانلود کنید یا این اپلیکیشن را مستقیما از این لینک دانلود کرده و یا هم لینک دانلود مستقیم آن را برای تلفن اندروید با ارسال ایمیل به این آدرس دریافت کنید.
Let's talk about NATO operations that you're also involved in that. How successful was it prior to US troops withdrawal, and tell us about achievement and goals at that time that you're proud of.
Counter-narcotics operations were very successful. At the end of the day, the Taliban generates its revenue predominantly from drugs. And they had this opiates business for 20 years plus, where they were involved in taking this raw opium, drying it out, making it into morphine, making it into heroin, and trafficking it globally. And keep in mind, 97% of the world's heroin is sourced from Afghanistan, predominantly Helmand, but also Baghdad province. But once the Taliban discovered this plant in the mountainous central regions of Afghanistan, this Ephedra-based plant called the Oman. They started making crystal methamphetamine with this ephedra source, this natural plant. It's very interesting because for any counter-narcotics expert, when you look at cocaine, you think, okay, Colombia, South America. You're thinking about the region where that plant comes from, right? And when you think about heroin, you're thinking about, okay, you know, that Golden Crescent area where it's the Chinese market. You're thinking about Mexican heroin market for the United States, and you're thinking about Afghanistan. You're thinking about geography. But methamphetamine is an interesting drug because it's always been thought of as synthetic. So you could make it anywhere. You could create an industrial scale crystal methamphetamine production infrastructure anywhere because it's not necessarily dependent on a plant in the ground. Afghanistan and the Taliban changed that completely. We start seeing a plant growing like a weed in the ground that's being used for industrial scale crystal methamphetamine production. And the Taliban were making an absolute fortune from it, trafficking it all over the world. And that inclusion of the crystal meth product line, along with the heroin, really made Afghanistan the global epicenter of drugs. I mean, it's not even close. So you not only have a terror state, but you have the #1 narco-terror state in the world, and in a post-drawdown environment, the #1 terrorist state in the world. For me, to understand that they generate the revenue from the drugs, and then they turn that money through a money laundering process that we could talk about, but they turn that revenue generation into lethal aid, into sustainment. They turn it into weapons. They turn it into salaries for their fighters. They pay martyrdom funds from it. It's equipment, it's vehicles, it's safe houses, it's ammunition. So their ability to sustain their insurgency for all this time has been largely as a direct result of the drug trade. So for me, anytime we could disrupt that revenue generation event, which is that drug production, or the access to funds through Hawala, through the formal banking system, anytime we could disrupt that was a huge win.
هایل کاوشگری و ژرفنگری رویدادهای داغ روز در افغانستان زیر سلطه طالبان. بحرانات موجود در افغانستان، چگونگی رویدادها، تقابل دیدگاه‌ها، بحث و مناظره در مورد راه حل مشکلات و بنبست‌های موجود در آن کشور از زبان کارشناسان، تحلیلگران و مسئولان. هایل هر جمعه شب ساعت 7:30 به وقت افغانستان از شبکه ماهواره‌ای و نشرات دیجیتالی صدای امریکا.
Operations against the drug product in Afghanistan, and there was also successful, I think, operations destroying a lot of meth labs in Afghanistan. So after the US troops withdrawal, how do you see these activities now going on in Afghanistan? Are you aware or do you have information about it? The Taliban are abusing it?
Great question. So yes, at the time when all these meth labs were destroyed, it was very, very successful because it denied a tremendous amount of revenue. Now the Taliban came out and lied and said, oh, the Americans, killed a bunch of women and children. It just wasn't true. Those operations were very, very targeted and focused, and it really, really had a just massive, massive revenue denial. It was just crushing to the Taliban at the time. In a post-drawdown environment, obviously, we can't stop that drug trade. And for the Taliban to come out and say they're no longer in the opium and heroin business, they're no longer making methamphetamine, it's just not true. And I'll tell you how we know that it's not true, Zheela. It's not like a drug user is going to tell us somewhere in the world, hey, I can't get my heroin, I can't get my meth. But the drug business, just like any legitimate business, deals with supply chains, right? So there's supply and there's demand. Anytime there's a high demand, we see this right now all over the world, right? We see inflation issues, we see supply chain shortages here in the West, right? So when a product is not available, but the demand still exists, we see that as a very noticeable problem. And that's where we have a lot of economic issues right now currently in the United States. It's not like the drug user is going to come out and say, I can't get my drugs. But you would hear about it if they couldn't, because the DEA and other international and national counter-narcotics law enforcement agencies would be reporting this decline. We would also see a huge transition in prices per kilogram of heroin, of methamphetamine. we would see the price of that product skyrocket if the Afghan supply of those products had went away. What do you think we're seeing instead, Zheela? Instead, we're seeing the price of that product go down because the market is being saturated with lots and lots and lots of Afghan-sourced heroin and meth. And keep in mind, Afghanistan is responsible for like 85 to 90% of the world's heroin. So if we did see a disruption in Afghan-sourced drugs, we would see a shortage of supply and we would see changes in prices. So it's not true, they're lying.
امریکا یکی از کشورهایی که میزبان فرهنگ‌ها، ملیت‌ها، سنت‌ها و ارزش‌های متنوع و بسیار مختلف از سراسر جهان است. زندگی در امریکا و مهاجرت به اینجا مانند سایر کشورها سختی‌ها و لذت‌های خود را دارد. برخی افراد با تلاش و با استفاده از فرصت‌ها می‌توانند به رویاهای خود برسند و برخی‌ها با مشکلات روبرو می‌شوند. زندگی در امریکا هر جمعه از ساعت 6 الی 6 و نیم بعد از ظهر به وقت افغانستان و از ساعت 9 و نیم الی 10 قبل از ظهر به وقت شرق امریکا.
Claim that they destroy a lot of opium fields and products. So are you arguing that Taliban has generating some kind of revenue from illegal drug products and selling it to other countries?
So keep in mind, prior to the drawdown, for 20 years plus, the Taliban have always had an involvement in the opiates business. Now, it could mean that they were charging a tax as a zakat to the producers, to the farmers that were farming the opium. It could mean that they were charging a tax on the drug labs. It could mean that they owned the drug lab. It could mean that they charged a tax at various checkpoints for the drugs to get out of country. And sometimes it could mean that they owned the heroin end product. But oftentimes there were other narcotics producers that would maintain a significant portion of the revenue. The key distinction here is that in the methamphetamine business, the Taliban owned all of it, completely through and through. Now, as we transition to a post-drawdown environment, what would have been a tax situation, checkpoints, drug production, things of that sort, now we see that the Taliban is going to own 100% of that heroin business as well, because they are the government, they are the state, right? So I would argue that the revenue, the profit margin for the Taliban when it comes to drugs in a post-drawdown environment is many multiples higher. And I would argue that any mention of them destroying opium fields or pulling back in the drug business is ridiculous. It's a lie. It's not true. There's a lot of sanctions and economic pressure on the Taliban right now. This is their main revenue generator, so there's absolutely zero chance that they're going to go away from drugs.
So let's talk about the threats inside Afghanistan, ISK and Al-Qaeda. How do you see the ISK threatening the Taliban or somehow undermining the security? The Taliban claim that we maintain security in Afghanistan since they took over. So how do you see ISK activities inside Afghanistan?
So I have a little bit of a controversial view on this, Zheela. You know, I look back to a year ago today when we dealt with the withdrawal and the Hamid Karzai International Airport attack that was purportedly by an ISIS-K member that had been released from Bagram, right? Now keep in mind at the time that that airport, the exterior of that airport, was being guarded by Haqqani Network Badri 313 members, okay? This is publicly out there, this is open source information. Badri 313 was securing that airport. Now, it is a unit within the Haqqani Network that has a specialty in explosives. They are bomb experts. So here comes someone from ISIS-K, and they conduct this huge suicide attack, and they kill American Marines, they kill innocent Afghan civilians. Where are all the Taliban and Haqqani deaths? So if it were true that ISIS-K was the enemy of the Taliban, where are all the dead Taliban? Where are all the dead Haqqani? The truth is, there's a fundamental difference between ISIS Khorasan, the Afghan-based ISIS, and what we would call ISIS core, or the Iraq and Syria Levant-based ISIS. The ISIS core, the organization that declared an Islamic caliphate, was a byproduct of a lot of diasporas of jihadis from all over the world not only the United States and Europe, but really out of the Arab Spring movement. You know, you saw a lot of jihadis that went to Egypt to be a part of the Morsi Muslim Brotherhood regime. And when that regime was basically pushed out in a coup by al-Sisi in Egypt, you saw a lot of these young men basically thought, where am I going to go next? And they saw Al-Qaeda of Iraq restructure in Iraq as ISI, Islamic State of Iraq, and they saw their Sunni brothers fighting Bashar al-Assad's forces in Syria, and they banded together and they created ISIS. So we have to understand that this was a collective of many, many different source groups of people from different countries out of the Arab Spring. However, when we look at ISIS-K in Afghanistan, we're dealing with an organization that's predominantly Afghanis. And when we see the Taliban, we're looking at Pashtuns, we're looking at Baluchis, we're looking at ethnic enclaves from the south that cross over into Pakistan. ISIS-K, again, still Afghanis, but we're looking at a lot of folks from the north that have a Turkmen or Tajik background, for example. But they are Afghanis. And one of the things that we remember is that there already was a war between the Taliban and ISIS-K. It was in 2018, it was in 2019, and ISIS-K lost. They were pushed back into Pakistan through the Peshawar. Now think about what I'm saying, Zheela. They were pushed into Pakistan. What does that mean? That means that they had better relationships in Pakistan.
خوانندگان گرامی صدای امریکا، انتظار به پایان رسید. اکنون با دانلود کردن اپلیکیشن های NTH Link و سایفن شما به گونه مسئول با حفظ محرمیت به اینترنت بدون سانسور در هر جا دسترسی خواهید داشت. برای نصب کردن اپلیکیشن NTH Link اگر تلفن اندروید دارید به گوگل پلی و اگر آیفون دارید به اپل استور رفته و NTH Link را جستجو و دانلود کنید یا اپلیکیشن را مستقیما از این لینک دانلود کنید یا هم لینک دانلود مستقیم آن را برای تلفن اندروید با ارسال ایمیل به این آدرس دریافت کنید. برای نصب کردن اپلیکیشن سایفن اگر تلفنتان اندروید است به گوگل پلی و اگر آیفون است به اپل استور رفته و سایفن را جستجو و دانلود کنید یا این اپلیکیشن را مستقیما از این لینک دانلود کرده و یا هم لینک دانلود مستقیم آن را برای تلفن اندروید با ارسال ایمیل به این آدرس دریافت کنید.
So a lot of terrorist organizations are integrating inside Afghanistan with the Taliban return. As you mentioned, that ISK is really doing some of these attacks. Don't you think these groups threatening the Taliban leadership?
No, I don't believe that. I believe that there'll be infighting in the upper echelons of the Taliban. I mean, they've been fighting for 1,500 years, so they're not going to stop now, right? So there's going to be infighting. There's going to be people periodically killed or pushed out of power. But the reality is the Taliban have won the war. They've consolidated power. And I think if you are another terrorist organization, you have an amenable ideology, radical Sunni, ideology based on the same fundamental beliefs, why wouldn't you go to Afghanistan for safe haven? If you're an Al-Qaeda, for example, we know Ayman al-Zawahiri was just killed. Why wouldn't you approach the Taliban and seek safe haven there? They know that the United States and the West and NATO are unlikely to come back soon. So if you want to have an external operations program, and what I mean by that, Zheela, is you're a terrorist organization that has ambitions to attack an external country, such as the United States, such as a country in Europe, for example. You need a place that you can have safe haven, that you can generate income, that you can train your fighters, that you can provide for all the planning, operational planning and sustainment capabilities, and source people, such as through these radical madrasas. I mean, we always saw the Pakistani madrasas used to send kids north to fight with the Taliban. Well, now we have Afghan-based radical madrasas. So you have all the kids that you could ever need to become terrorists and join these organizations. So I think every major Sunni terrorist organization in the world that has an ideology that would be amenable with the Taliban is probably seeking safe haven in some respect with the Taliban, or seeking a relationship. So I don't think anybody's going to threaten their leadership. Maybe an organization that has pro-Western views or more democratic views, such as an NRF type organization. But I don't foresee a terrorist organization rivaling the Taliban in Afghanistan.
مرور هفته‌وار بر مهمترین رویدادها و گزارش‌ها از افغانستان و جهان هر جمعه شب از ساعت 7 تا 7:30 در برنامه 30 دقیقه از تلویزیون آشنا صدای امریکا. پخش زنده این برنامه را در نشرات ماهواره‌ای صدای امریکا نیز دنبال کرده می توانید.
United Nations has been discussing the situation in Afghanistan and also talking about imposing more sanctions on the Taliban because of not cutting the ties with the Al-Qaeda groups in their activities, as you mentioned. At the same time, Taliban are really seeking international recognition. So how do you see these efforts are going and how it can really pressure the Taliban to respect the universal human rights and women's rights and that they are leading the country, they cannot really suffocate their people?
Right. So this is for all of us Westerners that have worked with the Afghan people, that love the Afghan people, this is a really, really challenging policy matter for us to address. On one hand, we need to suppress all of the threats coming out of Afghanistan. That includes terrorist attacks that could be sourced out of Afghanistan, the drugs that are coming out of Afghanistan, the sanctions evasion. There's a lot of threats in this country right now. Conversely, there's a huge humanitarian issue, right? So how do we suppress these risks but also support the people? I think the Afghan Adjustment Act is a great way to do that. My viewpoint is that we need to get our friends and allies and the people that are suffering out of Afghanistan and offer them an opportunity for SIV, offer them opportunity for humanitarian parole, and get them placed in the United States, get them placed in Europe, in the Balkans, with partner countries that are willing to participate. We need to continue to support those legal immigration efforts. And then in doing so, we can start to begin to isolate what remains. Obviously, that's going to create suffering for people. We're going to continue to de-risk their banking system. They're not going to be able to access the US dollar or the international financial institutions, and all of our partners are likely to do the same. We should suppress travel. Taliban should not be allowed to travel anywhere in the world. And that's not just from a Department of State perspective. That means engaging all of our partners in the international community and having continuity of that effort to make sure that these guys aren't going to be able to travel. And we need to isolate the Taliban in Afghanistan from the rest of the world. And ultimately, hopefully that will create pressures where the people that remain realize that this is not the government that they hoped it would be.
But the Taliban claim that they have changed and they are bringing a different type of government in Afghanistan. So do you think Taliban has changed? The 2.0 version is different than 1.0 version that you know?
I mean, I think if anything, Zheela, you know this as well as I do, the humanitarian situation now is worse than it was 20 years ago, particularly for women and girls. I mean, the situation has never been worse. You know, imagine, and I know you can, imagine 25 years ago dealing with the Taliban regime. Compared to now, a lot of these girls that have grown up, the United States and NATO has always been there. They went to school, they had advanced educations, they were doctors, they were lawyers, they worked with the police force, they worked with the military, they did all of these different things. They worked in the diplomatic services. Imagine being told now that you can't go to work, that you can't seek an education. Imagine as a woman having to tell your daughter that. I mean, it's way worse because we were able to show the Afghan people, this is, you are worth more. You are worth more as a person than the Taliban let you think you're worth more. You are capable of more than the Taliban let you think that you are. And now they've taken it all away. I mean, that's heart-wrenching. It's heart-wrenching. So I think it's a lot worse.